Thanks for attending. I am Bob Culp. I imagine they had some kind of a grand resume to read, which would have been mostly lies, so I'll just tell you about myself. I'm a roofing contractor. Started a company 26 years ago in central Wisconsin. We have been full service. About a third of our business is residential, about a third is steep slope institutional, and about a third is flat roof commercial projects. About 10 years ago, we got into interior spray foam building envelope issues, and we found that to be a really good fit with the roofing industry. About 2 years ago, 3 years now actually, we got into solar photovoltaic, and I was just over at a panel next door that I moderated talking about solar PV. We've installed about 40 solar photovoltaic roof systems. So what I'm bringing to you is hopefully some boots on the ground thoughts and concepts, particularly about northern climate specifics. And when I talk northern climate, I'm looking at the darker green, blue, and possibly some of the green. Some of the principles that I'll be sharing, you just have to take the inverse of for the southern climates. I want to really know kind of who's here. Just looking at the map, are you green or are you orange? Let's say, who's in the blue zone? Blue or dark blue? Good, okay. Who is in the green or lighter green? Okay. Anybody in the yellow, orange, or tan? Couple of you, okay. So we've got a diverse group. I'll try to remember that as I go along, and if you guys in the orange, think I'm nuts, then, you feel free to leave, but I would prefer that you stay. But, it's because really building science principles it really is very simple. It's hot moves to cold, wet moves to dry. It's just a matter of where you're going to place a vapor barrier. So why are you here today? Just a couple of quick shout outs as to why you're here. How many of you know me? Got a handful. Nick, I was hoping you'd raise your hand. After golf the other day, I wasn't sure. So you're not here because you know me. That's a good sign. Typically my family shows up to these things, and I'm always happy about that. But why are you here? Where's your area? Pacific Northwest. Interesting. Okay. Anybody else? Just it looked like the best show out of the... Go ahead.
Air barriers are going to be required in the code.
Okay. We already have them in Wisconsin required in the code, not really enforced, but go ahead.
I see a lot more emphasis on air barriers from architects on new construction.
And that's interesting because in our area, we're driving it the other way. We've seen the issue and are actually challenging architects to, hey, look, you've got to be talking an air barrier here because these are the failures we've seen. I do dozens of these presentations a year to architectural groups, specifier groups, and they're finally getting it up north. So it's interesting. Where are you from now? Virginia, okay. And in the Mid-South, frankly, it's not as big a deal. It will be when it comes to code. But it's not as big a deal in the Mid-South because you're close enough, you don't have the temperature extremes. Anyone else why you're here today?
Where to install an air barrier or the vapor barrier.
How's that again?
Where to install an air barrier or the vapor barrier. How do you marry the two together when you get both?
Tom wants to know where do you install a vapor barrier and air barrier, and where does it go in the assembly? And that's $1 million question. We'll talk about that a little bit. Go ahead, in the back. Okay, that's a question we may get, and that is mechanical ventilation as it relates to air vapor barrier in a residential application. Lack of mechanical ventilation. Excellent question. And we've had some of that. This is primarily going to be a roofing talk, although you'll see a lot of walls in our case studies that have kind of blown out and caused issues as well. But any other things that you're here for today before we move along? And what do you expect to take away from this session? These two questions are really one. Go ahead. Okay, in Texas you're seeing air barrier specs going into government work only, or the broad brush? Okay, you're saying you have northern architects specifying air barriers. Now that would really mess you up. That's just as bad as having a southern architect specify an air barrier on the wrong side, which has happened for us. So you want to make sure that you're smarter than the architect. How many architects in the room? Couple. I think I can diss you guys. Typically that isn't too hard to do, to be more knowledgeable about your specific field than the architectural community, unless they're at a show like this, in which case they are so smart in every way that you can't get smarter than that. So we already went through this, northern tier, southern tier. We've also asked a question about spec writers, architects. I asked specifically, how many specification writers or roof consultants, for instance, in the room? Okay, a handful, half a dozen. You will teach us at the end, so we're all good there. How many manufacturers? A couple. Okay, we'll hopefully get some input from the manufacturing community. Installers, installations, roofing contractors, managers. Okay, that's the bulk of the group. That's what the demographic that I got before suggested. How many of you are just in sales? Now, when I say just in sales, sales and project management, but not necessarily upper level management. Okay, a number of you. And that's just kind of gives me an idea as to how to address and how to proceed here. The goals of... Are there any questions before we start? The goals today are to understand the need for air barriers and vapor retarders. And I think Mark Graham said the other morning that there is no such a thing as a true air barrier. And that is exactly correct. It's the terminology I'm going to use. I've gotten away from using vapor barrier because vapor barriers are more squirrely than air barriers to get there. We're not going to talk a lot about necessarily the exact specification, ASTM tests and those kinds of things. Those are valuable and important to know, but we're going to talk about just case studies, what happens, what we've seen in our far north extreme environment. So live with the term air barrier and understand that it is really only an air retarder. And a vapor barrier is really a vapor retarder, and I've adopted that language. So for purposes of this discussion, let's do that. One of the things that we see in the roofing industry is you have to add ventilation. And I'm going to give you food for thought that hopefully will challenge that as a knee-jerk reaction today. And I want to end up having you go out of here understanding when adding ventilation isn't enough or isn't even appropriate. And we're going to know what the driving trend is toward tighter buildings. We're going to understand how to extend the life of buildings and roof assemblies with proper design and installation of air barriers and vapor retarders. Look at war stories from the field. I don't have to tell you guys. I mean, we know this. We're in the construction industry. Things have changed. I looked at a pie chart the other morning at breakfast of how much percentage of built-up roofing was done just 10, 12 years ago. And it's phenomenal compared to today. I think it was 42% in 2001. 2011, it's 24%. And it wasn't just a flip-flop of the numbers. That's how much that's decreased. BUR, if you roll the clock back 30 years, was the predominant market. So things have changed in the roofing industry. Things have changed in the building industry as a whole. Used to be lath and plaster back in the house that I grew up in 1940, that was built in 41. I'm not that old, but it was built in 41, lath and plaster. Whole different dynamic than drywall. I mean, you can just go through every piece of the building. They're a lot more complex. They're a lot more detailed. It's about cheaper, faster, lighter, and more efficient. That's what's really drives the American economy, whether it's electronics or buildings. The whole thing is faster, cheaper, lighter, more efficient. And, of course, a building design requires a delicate balance of those faster, cheaper, lighter, more efficient things. You've got insulation, heating, ventilating, air conditioning, plumbing, electrical systems. Plus the fact that occupant demands are a lot different now than they were in the house that was built in 41 that I grew up in. Goodness, northern Indiana where I grew up, you'd wake up in the morning on a cold winter day and you'd have frost on your nose in the upstairs. Now, you could still build a house like that, but you can't sell a house like that these days, and per code, it wouldn't meet code. So occupants have said, I don't want more than a 2-3 degree temperature difference from one room to the other. I want it to look good. I want it to not be drafty. I want to keep my humidity levels at a certain point because of wood floor considerations or piano considerations or all of the things that go into it. Now, why are we talking about this and we're roofing contractors? Because I think one of the lost opportunities that we roofing contractors have not gotten as a whole is the fact that we are a very integral part of the entire building envelope. And if we start to see the entire building envelope, I think we'll get the vision of what we can do. And of course, another thing that's driving the trend is increased energy prices. This is off the Department of Energy website over the last, 12, 13 years. And it's gone up steadily. Natural gas has stayed more stable than propane and number 2 heating oil. But the least you can say about is that it's volatile and that it's on an uptrend. By the way, if anyone has any questions along the way, I enjoy interaction. I can tend to get up here and just kind of ramble, but please just put up your hand. I read an audience fairly well. So, another thing that's driving the thing is codes. We heard that from a couple of the gentlemen here. And I want to just go with a disclaimer that these are my observations. This presentation is my observation. It is not meant to be a definitive discussion of codes or standards relative to insulation values, venting, or air barriers. Okay, I may say some things that maybe they won't kick me out and they'll never ask me back. I don't know. And if that's the case, that's good. But I'm just going to talk from my heart, what I've seen, what I've experienced, and let you guys do the research and make certain that you are code compliant along the way, or challenging and shaping the codes in a honorable and just way. So again, it's considerations, concepts for considerations that I'm giving you so that you can ask additional questions and do your own research. Now, condensation. That's what air barriers, vapor retarders are to keep from happening. And of course, if you don't keep condensation from happening and you get moisture trapped into a wall or a roof, you can make a building uninhabitable because of the mold. And again, slides, I like to just kind of talk. You can kind of read the slide yourself. But basically, there's a rise in asthma. There's all kinds of health issues that are associated with it. I'll tell you a story a little bit later about a guy who was almost on the point of death, and he fixed his building up, and he sprang back to life. Not quite like Lazarus, not quite that cool, but close enough. It was pretty good. Obviously, mold grows in temperatures and humidities about where human beings like it. We could get it so cold that mold wouldn't grow. We could get it so hot that mold wouldn't grow, but then we wouldn't want to live there. Mold has to have a food source. Cellulose, paper, wood fiber, any kind of carbon is really a good food source for mold, and it can grow prolifically if it is continually saturated with water. This is a chart I pulled off a number of years ago that I've always been kind of impressed with, the narrow relative humidity that you want to keep your building so that you don't grow bacteria, so that, again, you can just kind of look that over. Too high humidity is bad, and too low is bad. Again, just take that chart for what it's worth. And while I'm on this chart, if you're going through your presentation, and maybe we don't have them printed out like we used to in past years. I don't see a lot of presentations here, but if you download them online, there's a chance that there'll be a dozen slides well, I know there's a dozen slides that are not in the presentation that I'm going to be covering, and one or two are shifted. I literally had to do this for Brandy back in October, and because she was going on maternity leave or something, so I enjoyed doing it way back then, but when I looked at it the other day, I shifted things around. So don't get too fixated on that, but I did just want to offer that as a disclaimer as well. Obviously, health issues. This was a new study back in 1999, basically saying that 100% of chronic sinus infections are related to mold. That would have been Mayo Clinic back in the day. IRE says that 90% of all building failures in the United States are related to moisture. Big Bad Wolf, what's he got to do with it? What did the Big Bad Wolf, what method of destruction did he use for the three little pigs? Are we all too far removed from that? I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in, I remember. A guy that talks a lot on building science issues up in Wisconsin put it this way, and I'll just repeat him because that way it won't be pinned to me, but he said if the Big Bad Wolf would have had any real brains or understanding of building, he would have just done what dogs do on a hydrant, and the building would have deteriorated a lot faster. So in other words, it's about moisture, not about the wind. One of my particular passions is that in Europe you have buildings that have literally stood for centuries, and they're functional. They may be energy hogs, but they're functional. In the United States, we end up throwing buildings away in a very short period of time, sometimes because they become uninhabitable because of moisture accumulation in spaces where you don't want it. This particular church is in the north of France. The tower was built in 1513. It's my wife and I standing on the street back in 2000. The reason I like this church is because my 11th great-grandpa was the mayor of this town back in 1550, okay? And this tower was already 37 years old when my 11th great-grandpa was the mayor. And that building was actually in the process of being re-roofed, and it was really cool to watch them, not the spire itself, but the main church. They actually built a structure above the structure. Now, I know you guys do that probably in Dallas and Miami and those kind of cool places, but in the north, we just tear off the roof and cover it in. But they literally put a structure above the structure to preserve the re-roof, and then they took the structure away when they were done. Fascinating process. Again, historical preservation versus a disposable culture. Let's build it as cheap, as light, as fast, and as efficient as possible without thinking about crossing the T's and dotting the I's. That's what we're here to talk about. Again, why did they last a long time? They were using materials that were impervious to moisture damage. You didn't have a problem with them soaking up moisture. There was no insulation. Therefore, the surfaces on the outside of the thermal barrier were about the same as on the inside. I mean, you really didn't have a differential. And you often had a cheap heat source, wood or coal, just throw a little more wood on the fire. And you had obviously no HVAC, so you didn't have the pressure differential that you do in modern buildings. Now, as roofing contractors, we could talk, and it would be, most of these sessions are about the priority of keeping bulk water out of your roof, your walls, foundation. We all understand capillary action, the intrusion through drainage planes and flashings. But the purpose of this talk is really to look at a very often forgotten aspect, and that is water vapor and the transport by air and by diffusion. How many of you know and understand the difference between air transport and vapor diffusion? If you do, don't be ashamed to raise your hand. If you don't, we'll spend a little more time on it. Not that it's a complex process, but thanks. This is a roof in Wisconsin. It's a picture. It's about 6-8 years old. It is about a 4-inch layer of snow. Looks like a track where somebody walked. It's not. It's directly over a beam in a church that we're going to take apart a little bit later in one of our case studies. But if that's not a path where somebody walked, what is it? A melt pattern? Did I hear somebody say that? Yeah, basically it's showing a deficit in the building. And you can often visually see most areas of the country actually will get frost. And frost or a light coat of snow often tells you a lot about a roof and where it is failing. It's really a poor man's infrared camera, except you've got to wait for it to kind of be the perfect conditions. These are the boring slides that I inserted, about 6 or 8 of them. And they're not in your handout when you download them, but you can get this online pretty quickly. But basically, vapor retarders are measured in perms. A perm of 1 or less is considered a vapor retarder. A perm of 1 or more is considered semi-permeable up to a perm of 10. Why don't I just flip to that? And then from 10 on, you've got permeable. They're water permeable. What that means is that the water molecules go through the substance itself. And it's not possible to get to 100% non or impermeable, at least in my understanding. Now, it could be in the nanotechnology side that it would be. But even a pane of glass allows some water molecules to go through it. It has a very, very, very low perm rating. But contrast that with cellulose insulation or the ones in the bottom that are very vapor open. They literally allow water molecules to stream through en masse. So again, you've got the general categories of that. And air barriers are divided into the following. You've got air barrier materials, air barrier accessories, air barrier components, air barrier assemblies, and air barrier systems. And this is a couple of slides that I pulled from Mark Graham's presentation the other morning. Air barrier requirements are that they're continuous and across joints and assemblies, that they're sealed at the penetrations, and the test requirements for a whole building would be 0.4 cubic feet per minute per foot squared. An assembly is 0.04 cubic feet per minute per foot squared. And a material, again, the different classifications that we just showed you, is 0.004, 4,000ths of a cubic feet per meter per foot squared. Anyone have any questions on that slide? Some permitted materials without testing. Again, this is pulled off Mark's list from the NRL, whatever that legal thing is that the NRCA does. I can never say it right. National Legal Resource. You know, the one with the 5 letters in it. Take a look at that for a minute. This is something that was actually in the Energy Design Update paper. We got it from a state code official in Wisconsin who basically they were trying to describe and discuss and clarify what their particular, the state of Wisconsin code meant. And what I take away from this is that the most important fact to recognize is that an air barrier and vapor retarder perform different functions. Now, they can be the same material and work for both, but they, in theory and in actual fact, often perform different functions. Air barriers must be sealed, continuous, strong, air impermeable, and stiff. Vapor barriers need only be vapor impermeable, and sealing joints, small punctures, and cracks are usually not necessary. Does that confuse anybody? It doesn't me, because I've lived, breathed, and slept this for, many years. But if you have questions on that, I think it will become clear as we move along. Picture of a wall here. When a wall or ceiling has no penetrations, poly can work. And you'll see quite a few residential slides, but you'll also see quite a few commercial slides. So don't get turned off if I'm showing you the inside of a wall in a northern climate. It's okay. We'll get to the other cooler things in a bit. It gets pretty labor intensive if you're doing all of the tapes to seal it up nice and tightly on the inside. In the north, and this is a finished detail, but this is actually an electrical box with a box built back behind it with gaskets that the wires come into. How many of you have seen that in this room? A handful? Okay. That's something that is almost code in Wisconsin, and I believe it is in Minnesota for sure, in residential construction, where you have a sealed box behind the box in order to have an airtight seal and detail there. Now, are we going overkill here? I don't know. Let's move along and decide that as we go. That's often how it looks on the construction site. That's a project in Wausau, our local town, where electrician needed to get up after the vapor barrier was stuck up in the ceiling, and he took a utility knife and cut it out. And guess what? He had a little bit of electrical tape. This is not a staged photo, okay? This is what happened. A little bit of electrical tape, and then the duct guy came along, had a little bit of silver duct tape, and they kind of stuck it back up. And that's how it often gets destroyed in an interior of a building. Understand we're roofing contractors, but these are applicable points. Again, somebody needed to get up into that to install that. They cut it, draped it down. You've got little holes in the vapor barrier. This is an architect who spends a lot of time on the speaker circuit. Sometimes he shares lecterns with me, and I like him, except that he's an architect who can only draw continuous lines on paper. And continuous lines on paper are quite easy to draw compared to putting a piece of poly or an air vapor barrier where that line showed on the paper. In this particular case, this is a roof. This is the upper that's covered with drywall is a sloped roof interior, and the wall and a beam that supports the main assembly. Pretty hard to seal up around that beam. And of course, somebody needed to get in there, so they slid it, cut it. Again, this is not a staged photo. And I always kid with the high school students that I talk to for Habitat for Humanity class that there's this mythical creature called the Poly Genie. He's like the tooth fairy, only a little different. And he comes up at night, and every screw up that you made on your air vapor barrier, the Poly Genie fixes it automatically. And this is kind of some sloppy work from that mythical Poly Genie. Again, they needed to cut it to make that transition. This is still in the same building. How do you build so your plans are foolproof? How do you build so that it works in every winter, in every climate, no matter, or in your specific climate, no matter if we had a warm winter like we did in the north this year? We'll talk about that more. And of course, the drywall guys, they're actually, I'm always glad that there are drywall people because it elevates the roofing industry from the bottom. Now, if you don't agree with that, I apologize, but I've seen some pretty crazy drywall guys. But they always make sure that they take care not to mess with the integrity of anything that's been done that had to have been done. And when there is a leak in the air vapor barrier, this is what can happen: frost. This is actually our office, north wall, back on December 3rd of 2005, we were doing a major remodel. It was quite cold outside, probably 5-10 below zero. Some of you know what that's like. Others wish you did. And we have a nice snow peak up about 30 miles north of us. You're welcome to come up and visit when it's 20-30 below, and I'll buy you ski tickets there for it. So just saying, if you've never experienced that kind of cold, you might want to. When there's a leak in an air vapor barrier, that's what can happen. Now, as my kids and I were tearing this wall apart, I got to that frost, and I had been very passionate about sealing up all of the joints, I thought, back in 1988 when I built this. So I was shocked to find this, and I told the kids, run quick, get the camera. Why did I say run quick, get the camera? It's going to melt, absolutely. Exposed, take the insulation out, all of a sudden that outside sheeting turns into warm, inside warm. And I know we're talking walls here, but translate this up onto a roof. Same thing works on a roof assembly. This is why the house that I grew up in 1941, that was built in 1941, that I was telling you about, you can never keep paint on that siding. Wood siding. My dad fussed and fumed about not being able to keep paint on the siding. Finally, some slick-talking aluminum siding salesman came along, sold us aluminum siding. Done deal, right? No issues. Well, the reason was we were chasing all of those water molecules right out through that uninsulated building, and it was popping off the paint from the backside. Probably a good oil-based paint back in the 60s and 70s. And every 2-3 years we had to repaint that. And back then, stuff like that didn't matter. We weren't into aesthetics. It wasn't about cheaper, faster, lighter, more efficient necessarily, because wood was cheap. Another ton of coal cost $1 or $2 maybe, and we just put more on. When you insulate, you can cause problems. To not insulate is utterly irresponsible. But when you insulate, you can cause problems, because now you've turned the outside surface into a condensing plane unless you've got something, an air and vapor barrier on the inside. Go ahead. This is a wall, actually. Same principle applies. I just didn't have a picture of a roof.
Well, if this was a roof, I would say poor ventilation is the issue.
And I'm going to show you some place where they added ventilation much to their detriment, because I'm not a big fan of venting.
I understand what you're saying, but that is the theory behind ventilation, is to carry the vapor
Right.
out.
Yep.
So it doesn't.
And I'm going to be your controversial speaker this morning.
I'm a spray homer that does lots of unvented secrets.
Okay. A good man. We share common purpose there. Now, this is an interior wall in a building going up into an attic that would be vented as a rule. Somebody put a strip of plastic up on top of there, sealed up around all of the pipes and the wires going up through with looks like some kind of an expanding foam. And then after that little strip of plastic, they'd hang the rest of the plastic up on the ceiling, and then they'd carefully tape each of those joints. And there are people in Wisconsin and Minnesota who are absolutely nuts about doing this kind of thing. I mean, you literally go in that house and it is airtight. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'll give you some inclination as to what can be bad if you don't follow through with it. That's the hard way, but it's effective. Now, I draw back on my Amish and Mennonite heritage. My mom was Amish and my dad was Mennonite. And pardon me for getting so personal with you guys, but I just enjoy interacting a little bit. So I understand from my heritage doing stuff the hard way, no matter how long it takes, just keep on doing it the hard way. Well, again, that's effective, but it's the hard way to get there. Journal of Light Construction wrote an article about, this is a number of years old now, about how interior partitions can be leakier than the outside walls because of this is obnoxious, because of the cold air bypasses through the top plate, the cracks and the wires and the like. Again, we're dealing with residential here. Well, not necessarily residential. We're dealing with a vented type ceiling, steeper slope. The reason I know that to be true is, you'll see later on, we have a blower door that we bring to bear on smaller buildings where we depressurize the house to figure out where the roof leaks are, or where the air leaks are, pardon me. I was up in a ranch-style house up in Wausau, our town, and the lady had major ice damming and had issues that she couldn't quite figure out, and she was convinced that it was something to do with our roof, which our roof was put on according to specs, but that's where we as roofers always get the problem is, hey, you've got ice damming. And the problem is, if you did a better job on the roof, it would have been fixed. Well, we know that's not true, but roofers are easy to blame, and so we kind of roll with it. Put the blower door in the house, sucked as much air out of it as I could, just ran it at full tilt, wasn't trying to measure how much infiltration we had, just trying to evacuate the air. Went up into the attic, crawling up along the ridge beam or the center peak, and I'm hearing this sound like it's an airplane taking off about a mile away, and I'm like, what's that about? And called the lady on the cell phone. I said, turn that dial down on the fan and shut off the fan if you would. She did. Sound went away. I said, turn it back up. Turned it back up. Sounded like that jet plane taking off a mile away. Here it's all of the air rushing back into that ridge vent, into the house, and going out the front door through the blower door that you'll see a picture of later if you haven't seen it. That to me indicated that there's a lot of leaks in that. Oh, no wonder she's got ice damming, because she's got air leaks going up into her attic. So what she wanted to do was add another 6 inches of blown fiberglass insulation. How much good do you think that would do? in any case, we'll talk about why that might not be the best bet later. Again, just another picture of a wall. Building science, really, the things that harm a building are heat flow, air movement and pressures, radiation, moisture flow. Take those things away, we could all be Hitler's architects building buildings that'll last for 1,000 years. Because there's nothing else that really harms a building other than those four. And some have a greater degree of impact on a building than others do. Again, heat flows in 3 different ways, at least primarily. There's probably some scientists that would know others, but basically heat flows either from conduction, convection, or radiation. Question I always ask my high school habitat classes, and sometimes they answer it correctly, but which way does heat go? Which way does heat go? Towards cold. Good answer. Good answer. Everybody says heat rises. No, heat doesn't rise. Hot fluids rise. Hot air, hot water rises. But heat goes to cold. Wet goes to dry. Our value measures which of these components? Conduction, and only conduction. And I'm going to submit to you that convection moves a lot more heat than conduction does. Everyone understand conduction? The movement from one side to the other. If I put a hot or a hot cup of coffee up here, the bottom side will warm up. That's conduction. Convection is heat carried on currents of of a fluid. And then radiation, that's why if you stand by that bank of glass windows and it's really cold outside, your body feels cold on that side. Not because the cold is coming from the window and attacking your body, but because your body heat is radiating toward the cold surface. So that's the concept of radiation. Same thing the sun does, really. Any questions? And I think we're still plenty good on time. What time is this over? 11 o'clock. Oh, yeah, we'll have time for questions yet. Old dead French guy. I can't even say his name, but Fourier. Is that how you say that? He, a century or two ago, put together what he considered to be the law of diminishing returns on, he wasn't thinking R value because that's a relatively recent concept, but if you look at the thickness of insulation in inches on the bottom, let's just attribute an R value to that. Let's just say that's 4 and R4 per inch. Now I know that kind of probably messes up the graph a little bit, but the first R4 cuts 50,000 BTUs of heat flow. The second R4 cuts 10,000. The third R4 cuts whatever, 2,000. The fourth R4, now we're at R16, cuts almost nothing. But again, that's in an ideal world. That's where you have conduction only as a heat loss entity. So we've got codes, and God bless the code people, because we're going to sell a lot more insulation. This is not a problem with me, okay? But the codes are saying we're going to go from, an R20 or 25 to an R30 or 35 or whatever it is, if you were in Mark Graham's things. This is fine and good with me, but it really isn't necessary in terms of the overall scope. Now, am I suggesting that we stop with an R12? No, I am not. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But this is actual math, and I had a gentleman in one class I gave actually came up to me afterward with a hand-printed spreadsheet of exactly how that math figured out, and he said, "You were right." So if I've got anyone in here that is intellectual enough to do that, please do, and if I'm wrong, let me know. But you have a question or no? Okay. Board insulation losses. Those of us who were at breakfast with Mark the other day, a single layer or a double layer with staggered joints. Double layer is much better because, again, you've got a better chance of cutting that heat flow. If you have 1/8-inch gaps in 4x8 boards, you're going to be 10% less efficient than the board itself. If you've got 1/4-inch gaps, you're going to be 18% less efficient. That's a pretty big ding to take if you can tighten them up. Now, tightening them up is only one course of action. Double layer is only one course of action in a flat roof or any type of insulation assembly. The big deal is really keeping the air from getting into those cracks to start with, and that's why we're talking about air vapor barriers. Back to walls for a second. If you have a cold climate where it is, warm on the inside and cold on the outside, in a standard density fiberglass bat, you actually set up a convective loop in it. All insulations, R values are measured at what? An R40? Is that kind of the standard? Or sometimes they go to R70, but they give you different places where they measure the R value. An a 40 degree temperature Fahrenheit, an R19 bat has R19. If you drop it down to minus 18 degrees, which once in a blue moon we get that cold in Wisconsin, that 19 R value is now 9. It drops it by half because of the convective loops that are set up in that. Not so with a type of insulation that impedes airflow, like a high-density fiberglass bat, a sprayed rock wool, spray foam, you name the more air impermeable insulation doesn't happen. I imagine you have the same thing happen on the hot side. I don't know what happens when it gets to 110 degrees in, South Florida or South Texas as to what happens to that insulation. In Wisconsin, we have, the standard minimum has been an R38 in ceilings, and standard is pretty much an R50. Now, what I always ask my Habitat kids in high school, and often it's in a school that we did the roof on, and I happen to know exactly what's there for insulation, and I know that there's only an R20 or 24, and I ask them, how much insulation are you blowing in the Habitat house? Well, we're putting 15 inches of fiberglass in, which is more or less an R50. Well, why an R50 out there and an R20 in your building that you're in? Is it because the schools have excess budget to blow up through the roof? And, of course, the last year or so with the political environment in Wisconsin, you tend not to diss teachers and the like too much. And if you're not into political things, please don't get me started. But why is it that you need a lot more loose fill insulation? Friction? Okay. It's really about the convective losses. If you look at the arrow, you've got cold, dense air sinking down through that air-permeable insulation, sucking heat off. So you put a thicker blanket on, it's not as efficient of a blanket, but it's measured by the same matrix, and that is R value. This could be a building, it says house, but you've got a lot of places for stuff to leak out through. Of course, as sure as we in the roofing industry get air and vapor barriers totally figured out, what's going to happen is some HVAC contractor or plumbing contractor is going to get up there and he's going to jam a hole through that roof and not understand anything about why he did it wrong or the need to keep that vapor air barrier maximum integrity. Of course, you have wind pressures as well. If you draw out where the negative and positive pressures are, you can kind of see how buildings are pressurized. Infrared camera shots. How many of you own an infrared camera? Good. That's a good thing to see in the roofing industry, about half of you. Obviously, you've seen these pictures then. Not going to bore you with them. Concept that I want you to get before we go to the case studies is that buildings are basically, the only thing that's holding them down is the weight. Shucks, otherwise you've got so much air pressure in them, or likely, unless it's negatively pressured for a hospital environment or whatever. But I just want you to get the concept that you've got air that's wanting to get out, especially in a cold climate, because hot moves to cold, wet moves to dry, and you're expanding that house. Now, this is a Albuquerque Balloon Festival in 2004. We were there. I kind of liked the Remax house because it kind of made my point. But if you put a little bitty hole in the side of this balloon, it's not going to come down right away. If you put a lot of holes in, it will. But how many holes is too much, and how can we know in a building environment if we're building as tightly as that balloon? See, one of the misperceptions that just aggravates me, and I'll tell you it aggravates me because we're fellow roofers and we can appreciate when the other guy is aggravated, is people who said that buildings need to breathe. Now, occupants in buildings need to breathe. That's a good thing, otherwise we all end up dead in the morning, and that's not cool. But buildings themselves, to allow a random air leak out through anywhere in a building is not a good thing. It's a little bit like, well, okay, God gave us a nose, and it thankfully breathes in a place that isn't too stinky for us, okay? A random air leak is a little bit like breathing out of your armpit. It just doesn't make sense, and there's a lot of stuff that can go crazy if that happens. Buildings are basically big boxes of air, no matter if it's a little shack in the desert somewhere or, a tall skyscraper. Boxes of air, the higher you get, the more pressure you have. That's why they have revolving doors on skyscrapers. You all know that, to keep that air regulated going in. Outside air temperature, and this is a Wisconsin slide, can go from 30 below to 95 above. And the humidity can range from 5% to 100%. We like to keep the inside at, plus or minus 70 degrees and plus or minus 30 to 50% relative humidity. In our infinite wisdom, those of us who live in the north have decided we want to live in the tropics, but have our houses in the Arctic, okay? Stop and think about that. Isn't 70 degrees, 30 to 50% relative humidity what we've been experiencing here, and we're kind of in the tropics? And yet we want to move those conditions 2,000 miles north and live in that kind of an environment. Now, you've got 6,000 miles separating the equator from the pole, and you've got all kinds of things that happen in there. You've got thunderstorms, you've got hurricanes, you've got tornadoes, you've got all kinds of issues, weather issues that set up in that 6,000 miles. And we want to condense that into a 6-inch space. Stop and think about the dynamics that are going on potentially in that wall unless we have good barriers of separation. That makes sense? You guys are just waiting to get out of here. Diffusion. A 4x8 sheet of gypboard. This is a study that was done in Ottawa, Canada. How many of you have seen this study? You have. Okay, so you can't answer the next question that is going to have $20 for the right answer. I hope I got somebody's attention here. 4x8 sheet of drywall, 70 degrees, 40% relative humidity. In the course of one heating season in Ottawa, Canada, a third of a quart of water goes through that molecularly. Okay? Let's stick a 3/4 inch hole in that plywood, in that drywall. How much water goes through that 3/4 inch hole in the same environment? No guesses? 5 gallons, I heard somebody say. You're not quite right, but close. Let's go in quarts because it's easier to understand. Who said 30? An architect, and I'm paying him money. It's driving me crazy. I'm going to have to sleep tonight. Come up afterward and pick up your $20. Yes, 30 quarts of water through a 3/4 inch hole in a heating season. This is what's causing the devastation, and that's why I get passionate about air vapor barriers in my extreme climate. Again, you have to judge based on where your climate is, but I always think it's good to know how other parts of the world operate and what they have to face. Small holes that count, caulking at multiple framing members, sealing around windows. You've seen this kind of thing. If it's in the north, you better be caulking or sealing those. Better yet, putting caulking in between the framing members as you're putting them up. Again, I recognize that we're roofing contractors, but these kind of things can haunt you. This is a baseboard in a house, leaks above a window, leaks above a door, leaks. Happened to be our local weather guy at the Channel 7 News. This is a house from up north where we did spray foam in the upper level, and he called up and said, I've got icicles coming out of my house. I said, what does that look like? He said, come on up and check it out. So I went up and checked it out. Here, sure enough, we had tightened up the entire building with spray foam, except the guys that installed the windows decided that sticking some of that pink fiberglass in the window joint would be a really cool thing to do, and then putting trim on top, and that, of course, is now your weak spot. Very, very tight building, new construction, so we had all of that moisture from the basement pouring and the walls, poured foundation, all of the drywall, all of that moisture. This is a first season phenomenon here. And of course it was evident what he needed to do, take that out, put something in that the air wouldn't go through, and his icicles quit. This is a pool up north, and it's a summertime picture. I wish I had my January 23rd of 2002 picture. I drove out of here at a brand new building with a pool on the inside. Literally, this cultured stone had icicles hanging down the entire perspective. I understand, kind of know the owners there, but I understand they're having some major issues with that building that's less than 10 years old. Now, granted, it's a pool. Pools add a whole different environment. And for those of you who can't relate at all to what I'm saying relative to northern climates, understand that I know we're roofing contractors, but there's a huge opportunity in coolers and freezers and in understanding the dynamics of heat flow. And on the other side, on pools, and you have all of those opportunities. And that's what I'm hoping that you get out of this talk, is not just some technical talk with some pictures that we're going to see in a bit, but the inspiration that this can be something that makes your business well-rounded in the sense of understanding how to diagnose and cure and fix and get niche-y in terms of other business opportunities. If I did that, I did my job, and if I didn't, I didn't. We've all heard the horror stories about exterior insulation finish systems and how flashings and the like are problems. This is a house in Minnesota. This is not a series of pictures I took, but I know the gentleman very well who did. It's about an 8-year-old house, and they had a massive catastrophic failure. Can you see it on the picture? No, because it's not there. But let's take off the eaves. And that's what he has. Now, is that a water infiltration issue? Let me flip back to that slide. Any place where the water can get in? Nope. Not a thing wrong with the eaves. There's a reason for each of these. The upper ones was a bathroom and 2 lights up above a vanity. The lower one was also a bathroom. The corner one in the far corner, I don't know what that was. The one in the lower left-hand side of the slide there was a duct that went up through the wall and had a joint that wasn't sealed. If you ever find an HVAC contractor who actually religiously seals all of their ducting, congratulate him. Give him $20 or do something. Just say, hey, good job. But they never do. And the upper one is the one we're going to zero in on right behind the little tree there. There was 2 little boxes there that were causing the problems in that 5-6-year-old house in that particular spot. And that room was under pressure. It was a master bedroom, didn't have a return supply or return air duct of any sort, and it just was pressurizing everything and extruding out through, and the eaves wasn't enough to keep it. Now, I know this is a wall, but this is another wall. Just so you understand the concept of getting kind of tight, but maybe not totally tight, and thinking that kind of tight is good enough. It may be, and then again, it may not be. Building inspector, the home inspector said all of the siding's going to come off. This is a catastrophic failure. Do you see the failure? No, it's not really there. A little bit of staining underneath the windows, but this isn't a catastrophic failure. Let's just flip the house around. That's what the building inspector found, and he freaked out and he said, all of the siding's got to come off. What had happened was they had, in Minnesota again, tightened up this house to a really, really tight point. They did spray foam on the rim joists, but the installer forgot to squeeze the trigger for 3 seconds in the corner. And that was the weak point in the system. It basically directed all of the water toward that. Now translate this in your minds, if you will. It's not too big of a leap to see a roof in the same light where, we've used to build them just kind of the way they got built, and it might have been leaky, it might have been tight, we didn't really know. But if you get into air vapor barriers and start to tighten them up, you better make sure that you've got the little bitty ones done, or you're going to have some roofing consultant or somebody else, some lawyer get involved, And then everybody comes out in the white suits and they all have a house party, and it ends up in court somewhere, which is never fun. I don't speak from experience in that, thank God. But make sure that an air barrier vapor retarder is specified. Make sure it's installed properly. Communicate your concern to the general contractor, installation contractor. These are very critical points. When we see a set of plans that doesn't have a vapor barrier specified, we basically write a letter to the architect saying, look, it's not there. If you absolutely insist that we go ahead with this, we will do it. But we're going on record right now saying this is what you need and here's why. And that has often gotten us really good kudos and long-term relationships. Verify the building with depressurization testing, blower door, infrared camera, that the work was done right. Let's go into some case studies here. Yeah, we still do have plenty of time, so we're good. The original roof construction was, and I wish I had a picture or diagram of this. I don't. I do have a picture of the exterior of the building so you can visualize it, and I don't have a whiteboard to write on, but visualize a sloped steel roof deck with 22 gauge, over standard purlins. Architect specified a 4.5 inch vented nail base on top of that. Ice and water shield, 15-pound felt, fiberglass asphalt shingles on a 5 or 612 roof slope. What's missing? What's missing in the north? There was a ridge vent there, vapor retarder, yeah. And what's missing in the south, I can't tell you because I don't think you'd have built it any other way than this in the south. And it worked. It would have worked in Miami, very likely. Except for fiberglass shingles probably wouldn't have. I don't know. This is the church. This is the heat loss patterns that you see up there. Stop and think about a B deck. It was actually double layered nail base, but even with a staggered joints, air could get up through the B deck, through the insulation, up into that vent space. And the vent space in that case actually made it worse. It's not the reason I don't like venting as a rule, but the vent space actually made it worse because of the Venturi effect of the air going up through there would actually suck more warm air out of the building. It would have been a better scenario to have no vent space there, and possibly the roof wouldn't have failed. But then you can read case studies about SIPS panels. You've all seen structurally insulated panels. And if in the north, if you're building with those without sealing off the underside incredibly well, you will have massive panel failure because of the moisture migration up through there and traveling out through the upper layer of sheeting underneath the shingles. Repair of choice in that case was basically put in an air barrier, and in that case we did it with spray foam insulation. Like you see there, this is not the same project, but it's a representation. Yeah, see which one we're on. Okay. Another one, standard wood framing, drywall, air barrier, vapor retarder, fiberglass insulation, vented attic, ice and water shield, metal roof system. What's missing here? Nothing. That's the proper spec. So what happened this February? This general contractor called up. He was a little bit of a hothead and said, your roof's leaking. Well, of course, I live in the North Twos, and I know it hadn't snowed for 3 weeks, and it hadn't rained for 3 months. So I just asked, when did it last snow? Well, it snowed last about 3 weeks ago. When did it last rain? It rained last about 3 months ago. And the roof is leaking? You say it kind of dumb Columbo-like, and they kind of tend to kind of slow down a little bit. The roof is leaking? Yeah, it's leaking. Come on out here and fix it. Well, we went out. There's a light fixture. Somebody had a nice sealed light there. Poly vapor barrier. In this case, it's black, but the only reason you go clear is so that the inspector can see it, so there wasn't a problem. But there was nobody sealed between that light and the vapor barrier. It was directly over a hot food buffet with lots of water vapor. Obviously, you can see the little diagram arrow, and that's what caused the problem. And it cost $2,000 to fix this, and it would have been a 30 cents or 50 cents a caulk if somebody had considered that. Again, am I trying to put paranoia in you? No, thank God most of you don't live as stupid far north as I do, so you're good, or a little bit better. But it still is something that is very critical. You've obviously seen this kind of thing. If you're in the north, if you're in the south, you have an entirely different dynamic. That's a picture somebody emailed to me from Marshfield, which is another little town close to us. Said, I think we might have a problem. I think we maybe should add ventilation. I said, well, that would be probably something you could do. But where did all that frost come from? Well, I don't know, but we got to get it out of that attic. Now, in dialoguing with them a little bit, I realized, I said, well, you've got to have some major source like a bath fan that vents up into there or something. And obviously, I didn't actually hear the resolution to this story, which is one of the stories that I have to leave kind of loose-ended. I imagine they found the problem and fixed it. But adding ventilation would have possibly solved the symptom, but it would have never solved the problem.
Why does the one side have the frost on it, not the other?
That's a question I typically ask my Habitat kids. Why is that? Yep, south and north. Yep, it was oriented exactly that way. So the south side it had already burned off some, and the north side it was there.
How long did that problem take to recognize this? It's old as that building that now the units in there. This has to be an older building, so evidently some remodeling went on before they.
I think these were relatively new owners, and obviously you'd had a home inspector that probably wasn't doing his due diligence, sticking his head up into a nasty attic like that. I wish I knew more of the story behind this one. I just always am enamored of the picture. It's kind of a fun picture. This is a case. Can you see what we're looking at there? We're looking at trusses with frost and spider webs and fun. This is a case where some homeowner, in this case, said adding ventilation is a good thing. And he and his neighbor got together, and his neighbor said, I think you ought to put one of these great big commercial exhaust fans in this thing. Not just residential one like we'd see down on the floor here, but great big commercial exhaust fan. Run that sucker because you've definitely got problems. Ran it. First winter worked out okay. He said, well, if a fan is good in the wintertime, it's got to be good in the summertime. Kept the fan on full tilt all summer long. Next winter, he's thinking everything's good. His fan's still running. Long come November, he looks at his heat bill, and it's double what it was the year before. He's freaking out. How can I go from $300 to $600, and that's the price of heat up our way, $300 to $600 without stopping in the middle. Next month he gets the bill, it's double what it was the previous year, and it's basically the same heating degree days. So he gets my friend, this is another Minnesota home, out to look at it, and this is what he finds in the attic. What had happened is, worked the first winter. Over the course of the summer, this fan had so much suction, it sucked beetles and needles and all kinds of leaves and stuff into the intakes. Now where is it getting its massive airflow from? From the house. And that's why his heat bill went up. Adding ventilation, to me, this is a strong statement, controversial, you can beat me up afterward, but is an admission that we didn't get it right in terms of an air vapor barrier. To me, it's like a basement drain in your house. You've got a basement drain there in case there's a catastrophic plumbing leak. It runs to the drain, takes care of it, doesn't ruin all your stuff. So if you develop a leak, the drain is over there, and you develop a leak in that corner in your supply piping, what do? You call the plumber up, right? Have the plumber come, he gets out his concrete saw, he trenches over to directly underneath the leak, and puts another drain in there, right? No, you don't. You fix the leak. That's the point of what I'm saying with an air vapor barrier. Rather than putting in another drain, which is like putting in another vent, fix the leak. Then the vent is there as a relief if there is still something that you didn't get. How many of you found that just awfully controversial and are going to beat me up afterward just so I know who to avoid? Good. Whew. This is a pool, a 1-year-old pool in Wisconsin Dells, one of those great big old water parks. OSB on the sidewalls, flat roof, insulated well, everything done, except they didn't tie the wall and roof detail together. And this is where we roofers will come in every single time. They had nice Grifflin vapor barrier on the inside, nice on the underside of the roof deck, but they didn't make that transition. After a year, it looked like that. This is looking down into that wall cavity standing on the flat roof, and you saw right by the red arrow there, you see the vapor barrier. It's just kind of loose there in fiberglass. What was that supposed to stop? Well, it obviously didn't stop a thing. Turned into a nice $40,000, $50,000 project for us on this fairly small roof, but that's because we understood how to fix the problem. One way to fix it. I always like something that the air doesn't go through. To me, that's spray foam because it goes in easily, but it could be anything. It's just that in this particular case, spray foam really works very, very well. Sealed up, made sure that you had a mating of wall and roof barriers. Mark Graham actually touched on that the other morning, basically suggesting that that was going to be the overlooked piece. Another residential project. We did the new roof in 1997. Had a good roof deck at that point. Client decided he's going to do a major remodel in 2000. He's going to put in a new high-efficiency furnace. It's no longer taking air from the inside of the building. Now it's, all remote air coming in. He's going to install new windows, new sidewall insulation. And in 2003, literally had to spend $35,000 to fix what he had broken by doing what he did. And each one of those choices is a righteous choice. Nobody would say, don't put a high-efficiency furnace in, leave the old windows in. Tightened up the building, and he called me up and said, the roof is leaking. I said, really? I said, where is it leaking? And he said, all the way along the ridge. I said, you're actually seeing water inside? No, but I'm about falling through the roof deck. And I said, well, that doesn't quite sound like a roof leak, but let me come on out and take a look at it. And literally had rotten decking, rotten rafters, and all kinds of problems because this was actually an unvented roof system. You can see the insulation comes right up to the joist level there. This is a classic older cathedral ceiling. Comes right up to the top of the joist, and then the sheeting would go over top. So there was no venting there, and when we re-roofed it, we didn't put a ridge vent in because there was no purpose for a ridge vent because there was no space to vent. And what happened is he tightened up the rest of the house to the point where the only point of leakage is that where those panels, as a pre-manufactured home, those panels set on the middle beam, all of a sudden that became the main bypass, plus the fact that somebody back in the 70s, when they built this in their infinite wisdom, put little strip vents down along the eave. So there was no space for it to vent up, but strip vents. So all of that moisture had to come out of the house, travel down the slope, a 2.5-12 slope, and try to exhaust out of the eave vents at the eave, totally saturated that insulation. It was literally so wet you could wring water out of it. This is a gentleman I was telling you about that he was 62 years old. He said, I'm missing time at work. This was before we fixed it. He said, I only work about half the time because I'm just feeling dead, feeling like I can't move. We took care of air exchange, took care of basement sump, took care of getting all the nasty stuff out, spray foam insulation, in this case, new roof. Did a major repair. A year later, he said, I work all the time, feeling great, life's good. We brought the guy happiness and really his health back. Another case very similar to it. I'm not going to bore you with the details because there's a couple of really cool slides, or I think they're really cool, that I want to come up to. But this is the original construction of another cathedral roof. Basically had poly vapor barrier on exposed wood deck with a vent space, built according to code. No issues with code in this, nothing missing as far as spec. But after 2 years, he literally had to replace a part of his really cool ceiling because it was just dripping all over the place. So he and a neighbor got together and said, I know what to do. We're going to put some of that air impermeable, he didn't think in terms of that, but Thermax foam sheeting up, the foil face on either side of ISO. Going to put that up, take the ceiling down, put that up, put the ceiling back up. Problem solved. Problem kind of went away a little bit. It wasn't as bad, but 10 years later, he literally just couldn't stand it because it was, doing that to his ceiling, and it was just making him crazy. So when we pulled it apart, this is from the roof down, evidence of moisture. What he had failed to do was tape the seams or caulk the seams in that Thermax. And again, up north, that really matters. It might not matter in Paducah or Knoxville, and it would matter in a different way in Miami or Biloxi or New Orleans. But in the north, further north you get, the more critical that tape is. Infrared camera, it's not that particular house. We didn't own an infrared back when we did that one, but again, that's on a hot day outside. You can see the air coming in. We've done dozens and dozens of these in our area. Again, this is back to the same house with it's an innocent little hole like that can put in a lot of moisture into an assembly. Again, it's that 30 quarts of water that we're talking about through those little holes that can give you fits. Another case, a roof-to-wall detail here. This is a very low-sloped roof. We actually did end up putting a continuous ice and water shield and a DECRA shingle or DECRA tile panel on here. But he had the third roof on this building, and it was just causing him no end of headaches with ice damming and heat loss. And what we did in this case was go and cut above the wall so that we could spray foam from the top of the wall up to the underside of the sheeting and close off that very, very critical detail, and then put a poly vapor barrier down with insulation, 2 layers of staggered insulation. What you're seeing on the edge there is not staggered, but it's not installed either. Making that connection sealed up from the wall to the underside of the roof deck. I said allowing a building to breathe isn't a good idea. It's not a good idea, I think, in any part of the country. But this particular case, changing a roof color made it a lot of difference. It is 11 o'clock. We're supposed to be done, right? They're just clapping because they like the people over there? Is that? Okay. Because if it's not, we've got about 5 minutes left here. But roof on a church, they decided it needed a new roof after about 12 years. It had a poorly installed EPDM, black EPDM, nothing against black EPDMs, but they got price quotes and they said that they wanted to go with a white coating instead. Now, I'm a proponent of white roofing. I sat in the white roofing versus black yesterday morning and certainly understand the dynamics and the issues there and have no quarrels with the presenter. We've been successful in doing white roofing in the north for 25 years and wouldn't do anything else because, again, we understand the rest of the built environment as it needs to be. This particular case, they said, let's choose a $10,000 coating bid rather than a $20,000 new roof bid. We weren't one of the bidders, so we didn't have a horse in the race. And also, the point that I made earlier about weather being different in different years can make buildings function differently, especially if you're in the far north. I mean, you can have literally months without snow like we did this winter, and last winter we had snow in October that stayed all winter. Makes a huge amount of difference when it comes to how you build a building. This was the original construction. It's flat roof, had an unvented fiberglass space in a cavity. It lasted for 12 years with a black EPDM roof, 1/2-inch fiberboard with an EPDM on top. Again, the typical criminal is an exposed wood ceiling with a poly vapor barrier. Poly wasn't done the best. It was poorly draped back in a mechanical chase area, an exterior block wall. That's kind of what we had to start with. I've already gone over this. They said, do we roof it or not? And they went with a white coating. In January of 2003, We had 2 years in a row, 2003 and 2004, where we literally didn't have any snow until the 3rd or 4th week of January. Just boom, all of a sudden we got 6 inches of snow. Otherwise the snowmobile salespeople were going crazy because they couldn't sell anything. $30,000 worth of damage. The back of this church sanctuary literally had brown juice running down the walls, just totally stained it. They had 49 leaks throughout the sanctuary. They counted them. It was atrocious. And for 12 years, the building had been there, no issues. Home inspector came by. I don't know why home inspectors seem to do everything in our north, but they do. And he said, well, it's that little bitty stapled up, not stapled up vapor barrier. Go do that, fix that, put some spray foam in. I said, and I've got it in writing, no, that's not going to fix it. It's going to spend your money. We're happy to spend your money. That's no problem. But you need to go into further investigation here. It said, nope, we're out of money. I walked away with no guarantees and no caution that it would, and a caution that it wouldn't solve the problem at the end of the day. And I spent $5,000 of their money at that point. January 2004, same kind of year, no snow till late January. All of a sudden they're calling, and they're Baptists, so they were about as nice as Baptists can be, but they were kind of yelling and saying, you just screwed it up. I said, well, let's calm down, let's come down, take a look at it. At that point, we had our blower door and infrared camera, so we could actually diagnose it. And this is a picture of the inside of the building. You've got the main support beam coming out from there, the chase wall. You can see the spray foam where it's at, and you've got the air leakage issue. More air leakage. Again, random air leaks are a building's worst enemy. By the way, we've upgraded our camera. I paid $10,000 for that many years ago, and now I have one that does 8 times as much for $1,500, so go figure it. But that thing paid for itself, even at $10,000. What had happened? How many of you were in the discussion yesterday, white versus black? Okay, a handful of you were. Excellent discussion of what happened here, and you already know this then. Before the white coating got installed, if there was no snow up there, sun would come up even in January, and it would heat up that roof surface and drive that moisture back into the building. It would never accumulate. After the white coating is installed, now the sun comes up, temperature, that roof never gets above 30 degrees for literally months on end. They've got functions in the church, they've got humidity in the church. It all goes up through and collects on the underside of that roof deck. You've got an ice bank that develops from November through January. And then snow hits, and right away it leaks because it insulates that roof deck just enough to take it to above freezing. That's what was causing their leaks. Everyone understand that, or is there something that we need to make sure that you get? Because to me, this is the critical aspect of especially commercial roofing. And I know we've got both commercial and residential roofing contractors in here. But years change. Sometimes it snows, sometimes it doesn't in the north. You have all kinds of different dynamics. The one thing that never changes is the need for that tight barrier.
I have the same exact thing going on with the humidity matter also. If you put on a roof with black medium, white PVC, there's a pool in the building, it's a recreation center, and it was fine for a couple of years, and then we do HVA units or HVC units, and we want the dehumidifier, and as soon as it snows, it'll leak again.
Pools are squirrely. We've done a half a dozen of those, and you can never keep that humidity low enough to really matter. It's when you're dealing with a pool, you better have a bulletproof vapor barrier if you're building in the north. They need to make it. You know, one of my you think I'm fanatical? How many of you think I'm fanatical? Don't have to raise your hand for that. But if you think I'm fanatical, I go to building conventions in our north part where they say, we want the building so tight that when you walk out and slam the front door, the toilet flushes. Now that's tight, okay? I'm not quite at that point, but close enough that I could get there from here. I can see that from here. What we did was, again, brought the underdeck temperature above the dew point, connected the wall roof joints. That's the picture of the building. Again, it's that water that's doing it. This is actually a fun one. It was a phenolic foam insulation on a sloped roof on a church with a 20-year-old metal panel that was literally rusting from the underside all the way. Again, phenolic, we all had issues with that when it comes to roof decking because of moisture attacking that and killing it. This is the first time I saw it happen in the inverse, where water vapor coming up through the phenolic attacked the underside of the steel. Probably some of you have seen that, but it was a first for me. Again, quick way you can tell if you've got building issues is there moisture coming out of the soffit. This was somebody's attempt at sealing a problem on a school where the wall came up to a certain point and then the roof came in here like this. This was actually the original construction, where they just kind of stuck it all up in there and kind of pretended it would all work somehow. And I don't know where the genie went that day, but it didn't work. This was their first attempt at fixing it. They spent a lot of money and put up all kinds of stuff in a very tough to access area, drywall, and used some can foam, but they didn't worry about the little leaks in between the planks on the flat roof. And so we went in there and basically sprayed against that, injected into those cracks, got that thing. So again, that roof to wall connection is where it's really going to meet the rubber with you guys. And if you don't want problems, if you're building in the north, you'll make sure that that is very, very well handled and that communication is going on there. Especially as the air barrier code goes into place. Because right now, it could be migrating anywhere into the building and it never really collects in any one area big enough to worry about. But you start kind of tightening them down with an air barrier code, now you're going to see the problems. So how do you do it? You depressurize the building to make sure you know how tight it is. This is our little blower door. You can also get them. This is about a $6,000 or $7,000 blower door apparatus. If you're in the north or in the far south, they use these. Well, they use them all over, really. But well worth the investment. Well worth the investment. Blower door, infrared camera. Now all of a sudden you become the expert. How many of you own a blower door? Nick is a good man. Good. This is probably a huge lost opportunity in terms of if you're looking at doing something else. And I always think of things as an entrepreneur. That's who I am. That's who I've been. That's again, if I've conveyed a little bit of that to you all, I've kind of done my job. This is a great big Mongo. This is a 38 horsepower blower door. That's what I want for a big building. It actually goes on a trailer. You stick it in through a garage door and you suck building. What's not to like about something like that? You'd be the coolest guy on the block if you owned one. But adding R value again, the typical strategy isn't enough. We know what R value measures. We've talked about that before. Adding ventilation may increase issues because of higher heat bills and the Venturi effect. This is really a wrap-up, pulling moisture into cold spaces. Systems approach. A building isn't a collection of individual building materials that will perform satisfactorily as long as we just toss them together. Rather, it's the sum of interdependent components forming a system which will perform well only if appropriate components are chosen and installed properly. Now that, to me, says it all, and hopefully over the course of the last hour and a half, you will concur with some of those conclusions. Primary benefits of air leakage control are control of moisture transport and condensation, control of mold and mildew in building assemblies, make your buildings last longer, give you air quality, give your occupants health. We're into selling health and happiness, control drafts. And the nice thing about it is the energy conservation literally pays for it all. I think this is the next to final slide. You have two basic alternatives. Either you can build as loose as you want to with cheap, fast, efficient products, or you can really tighten the building as much as possible, provide mechanical fresh air ventilation so the people in the building can breathe, which is kind of important. Install healthy building materials, correctly size and seal HVAC equipment. That's the right way to build. Option 1 leads to inefficient, uncomfortable buildings that you can't sell. And option 2 provides a controlled environment that has good indoor air quality, will be durable, and conserve energy. Action steps to take from here: research and understand codes. I didn't do that for you. I told you that's not what this talk was about. Insist on a vapor barrier. If you're in the north, you know where it goes. If you're in the south, find out where it goes. If the code goes into place, you'll have Mark Graham telling you what to do and where to do it. Become a resource in your area. That's what we've done. It's been incredibly valuable for us. Consider purchasing diagnostic equipment. Many of you own an infrared camera already, but consider getting a blower door. And, hey, go out and make some satisfied customers and a lot of additional money. I probably have time for one question, but it is almost 11 o'clock, and so I appreciate it. I will be around. If you want to see me, please do. Otherwise, fill out the evaluation card. I do get graded on that, so.